Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I think this is the fourth time that Ruth and Arthur have invited me to be at the Berkeley Institute for the Study of Consciousness. And these talks have sort of evolved over the years, pursuing various aspects of the theme of the impact of psychedelics on consciousness and the way we model it. Tonight I want to talk about Eros and Psyche in the light of psilocybin, which is a more challenging subject for me to speak on and probably for you to listen to, because it's something which is close to the surface in everybody's lives. I want to offer initially a definition of Eros so that we can sort of keep that in mind as we move through it. The modern sense that has been given to Eros is a very narrow definition out of which the notion of erotic comes. I want to refer back to the classical notion of Eros and the definition that I like best, which is the one that Heidegger and other people who've commented on the pre-Socratic philosophers have elaborated, is longing for being. Eros is longing for being. And so I want to talk about the longing for being in the light of psilocybin and how the longing for being can be integrated into whatever level of being we've already achieved in our journey towards self-understanding. It's an interesting question. What are ideal relationships between people? And then what is the ideal relationship between a partnership and the rest of the world? Earlier in a lecture which I gave at Shared Visions last year, I talked about what I called alien love, which was the pure relationship between the ego and the alien other, perceived in an erotic dimension, perceived as presenting itself through the symbolism of the beloved, much as you get in the Song of Solomon or something like that. Now I want to concentrate more on how psilocybin affects relationships between people and how people so affected are then perceived by the world at large. To do this, I think we have to look back through the history of how people have cognized human relations. There is no species of animal that has as many variant mating and sexual customs as human beings. There is polyandry, polygamy, monogamy, parentally dictated marriage, group marriage. All forms of interrelation have been experimented with in human cultures as early back, as far back as we care to go. So there seems to be no baseline in human relationships the way there are in other animal species. The way two people relate to each other is largely determined by the historical and cultural context in which they find themselves. And in a global culture of the sort that is being formed now through the molding, through the flowing together of all cultures which were previously disparate, there is more pressure on this question of self-definition and more anxiety about reaching answers than I think there has probably been at any other time in the evolution of human consciousness. What appears to me to be happening in terms of hallucinogenic substances and why they can be factored into a discussion of Eros and the relationship of Eros to society is that they are elements which synergize consciousness. And I think you probably all are aware of the joke, what is the sexiest part of your body? And the answer is your mind, because the mind leads in defining what is fascinating, what is erotically beguiling or bewitching in a person's intellectual world. So whenever we talk about consciousness expansion or perturbation of consciousness with drugs, in the background we are talking about tampering with this appetition for being, with this realized erotic complex. And the way in which these various compounds act is to accentuate and synergize these kinds of feelings which we are more accustomed to seeing evolve in contexts where we have control, where we have our own control. The psychedelic state seems to show the generality of these states of being, so that, for instance, it's possible on psychedelics to have the realization that insight into self is insight into other people, that telepathy, the search for the carrier wave of telepathy, will always be frustrated, because what telepathy really is insight into self transferred into the context of dealing with other people. In other words, it's a way of realizing that we are all human atoms, sufficiently similar that you can generalize from your own inspection of your own interior processes. You can generalize to how other people actually operate. Most of my talk about the psychedelic experience has stressed ideas of various sorts, because my training is primarily as some kind of academic intellectual, and I'm very interested and adept with ideas. What is less often discussed, because it is, number one, harder to language, and number two, more personal, is that concomitant with the release of ideas on the part of a psychedelic substance, there is a release of emotion. And the emotional background against which the ideas are deployed is equally, if not more important in the long run when you assess the impact of a psychedelic experience. Now, most of us, and certainly myself included, are accustomed to thinking of emotions as coming in 4 or 5 flavors. These are the emotions which we can talk about. Jealousy, desire, disappointment, expectation. But these are not really emotions. These are more signs, not even symbols, but signs of emotions. Emotions are actually a context of multiplicity of impression that lies beyond language. In other words, people say it's very hard to talk about one's feelings. It certainly is, almost by definition, because feelings are those things which lie outside of the context of language, at least in any given present moment. I've taken recently to quoting the poem by Trumbull Stickney, where he says, "I lean over your meaning's edge and feel the dizziness of things you have not said." This dizziness of things unsaid refers to this primary ground of being, which is entirely emotional and which has been entirely devalued in our society, because it has really no utility in the capitalist sense. So that emotions are largely thought to be a hindrance, especially strong emotions. Actually, I think that emotions present the evolutionary frontier for becoming. I had this strange experience this summer of, I experimented with taking psilocybin at very low doses over an extended period of time, and slowly I began to have a feeling. And I watched the feeling very carefully, and I noticed that the feeling did not interfere with my going to sleep at night. And the feeling did not interfere with my getting up in the morning. So therefore I concluded that the feeling was a true emotion and not a chemical effect of the drug which was dragging down my system. Nevertheless, it felt like anxiety, this emotion, this feeling. But I allowed it to go on for many days. It was like anxiety without an object that didn't interfere with sleeping or waking. And eventually it receded into the background. It didn't change, but I lost this relationship to it, which was anxious. And I think that all feelings initially present themselves as anxiety. And this is why it's very hard for people to make their way into emotion, because the initial experience of making your way into emotion is anxiety. This is if you're moving on the three-dimensional plane of trying to work this all out in the context of day-to-day existence. A tribalizing of social expectation and context would remove this anxiety about the penetration into the realm of emotion, because the anxiety about emotion is, I think, uniquely linked to the ego's sense of being islanded. We are all told that our uniqueness is the thing that we must value. And this is not necessarily a print-created or capitalistic value. It's also a value pushed very heavily in Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, that human uniqueness is the thing to be maximized or concentrated on. And to a degree that's true, but to the degree that it makes the context of being recede from us to such a degree that we are alienated from each other, then it's overemphasized. Now, it was McLuhan in the 50s and early 60s who talked about how the evolution of information transfer systems, books, movies, television, this sort of thing, was changing the sensory ratios of human beings. And he felt that print, by being linear and uniform, had imposed linearity and uniformity on every aspect of human life, so that we no longer looked at manuscripts, we read books, we no longer thought of ourselves in the social context as folkloric personages, but as we were invited to think of ourselves as citizens. We were invited to entertain the notion that all men are equal, and that whatever differences are perceived among men should be de-emphasized for purposes of political economy and convenience. All of these myths arriving out of print-created linearity actually dehumanized human beings by shifting emphasis away from what was obvious, which is the context of experience, to various myths of the tribe being handed down from ever more and more abstract realms. The myth of the citizen, the myth of modern roles, the father, the mother, the child, the wage earner, the nurturer. What psychedelics do because they are generally a deconditioning agent, is they also strip away these print-created contexts. And what is discovered is a very messy kind of non-linear, non-uniform situation where every case has to be dealt with differently. So you cannot say, I am in a relationship, therefore I will behave this way and this way because these are the roles dictated by relationships. You have to realize that dealing with uniqueness, with the unique context of your own being, is the best way to satisfy this appetition for being, which we as moderns identify as erotic. So that what I'm advocating is a kind of, God forbid, a kind of dropping out on officially sanctioned myths of the tribe which dictate behavior and belief systems. It need not be beliefs like good husbands pay the bills. It could be other sorts of belief systems. But belief systems generally are constricting the arena of evolutionary experiment that is very important to fully occupy because our survival depends upon it. And I have noticed that, meetings like this cannot even occur without the myth, without certain myths being present and operable. But I hope that everybody realizes that these meetings occur because the myths are present and operable, but that's the only reason for their existence. They have no raison d'etre beyond allowing a context for their own transcendence, so that roles like speaker, listener, teacher, student, husband, wife, employer, employee, all of these things are derived from notions of uniformity that do great injustice to ourselves as we actually know ourselves to be. And a great deal of the tension in people's lives arises out of trying to measure themselves against role models which are found not really to exist anywhere. Now, why, other than the fact that psychedelic drugs, LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, ketamine, and to some degree these entheogenic compounds like MDA, they all seem to play on these themes. Why is psilocybin particular, or should it be singled out? Why didn't I call the lecture Hallucinogens and Eros? I think it's because psilocybin is actually somewhat in a category by itself because it is caught up with the origins. You see, consciousness itself is a kind of erotic modality. The words that we use to talk about ideas, to conceive them, to generate them, to hatch them, to incubate them, and so forth, indicate that at a very basic level of language, we associate the generation of ideas and the sexual act. These things are seen to be co-equivalent. It's almost as though ideation is a kind of parthenogenetic function where we give birth to alchemical children in the mind, which are ideas. Psilocybin synergizes this and has existed very early in the context of human social organization. I was looking this week at a painting done about 7,000 years ago on the Tassili Plateau in southern Algeria in Africa. And there you see dancing people holding mushrooms in their hands with mushrooms sprouting from their bodies in a context of domesticated animals, specifically cattle. Now, my hit on it is that when you get cattle and human beings together, and then there is usually a goddess cult accompanying the cattle cult, and the goddess cult leaves visible traces in the forms of statuary or paintings or that sort of thing. But these things, the component which does not survive is the mushroom, because it is the synergy of human beings and the mushroom that leads to the domestication of animals, which leads to the notion of caring expressed outside the self and in a social context that has a feedback to the whole social group that is supportive. So you can almost see in these Tasseli fresco paintings that people loved their cattle and had a greater sensitivity to their cattle than they really did to other human beings. But the context of the mushroom, the goddess worship, the stress on immediate experience, all conspired to create what I think is the original full expression of human becoming, which was in the moment, which was erotic, which was earth-oriented, but then which was gradually betrayed through the evolution of civilization, which I take to be a gradual intensifying of the ideational content in the psychedelic relationship at the expense of the emotional content. Weston LeBar, in talking about why did usage of psychedelic plants fade out in certain areas, he felt that with the invention of agriculture, it became so important for people to get up and go to their jobs, in other words, to submit themselves to a routine, that the orgiastic, ecstatic, all-night drug session became relegated to weekends and then finally disappeared entirely. Who can say? Bob Forte pointed out to me that at Eleusis, where there is considerable evidence worked out by Wasson and Hoffman and Ruck, that hallucinogenic ergot beers were being taken. When the god spoke to the celebrants, what the god always said was, procreate, procreate. In other words, the message of the god was an explicitly sexual message, almost as though, and this, you can still feel this with psilocybin, that it does have an immense fascination with human genes and where they go and what happens to them, almost as though it is acting as some kind of evolutionary catalyst. And this leads me to the idea of hallucinogens as exohormones, or sex hormones which are not generated within the context of the species. These are sex hormones which are involve more than one species. So that, and it's well understood that among monkeys, human beings are the most sexually active of the monkeys. And most higher mammals have estrus periods of being in heat when conception is possible that occur once or twice a year. Human beings have this hypersexual cycle of hormonal activity that allows conception to occur over a much larger space of the solar year. This hypersexuality of human beings cannot be divided away from the other hyper activities of human beings, the hyperlinguistic activity, the hyperideational activity, the large forebrain. All of these things have to be seen as response to a single phenomenon. It is almost as though that in outside of the Judeo-Christian context, expansion of consciousness and awareness of Eros are the same thing. And when you look at the Platonic definition of Eros, appetite for being, it's obvious that they are the same thing. We only have a peculiar way of linguistically dicing up reality, and because there is so much guilt laid on the sexual dimension by the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have placed it in a separate context from these other forms of development which we wish to synergize. I'm always amused when people say of Adam that it is that it gives you great empathy with people, but since it makes erection difficult, it's not really a drug which stimulates one to sexual activity. So it is almost a self-negating phenomenon, I think, in terms of biological impact, because the biological impact of a psychedelic in terms of evolution is that it gets you to recognize where your genes should go and then act upon it. And this is why the god at Eleusis was urging procreation. Now, why, in the general context of biology, would a reciprocal feedback relationship like this come into being? In other words, why is it important to a mushroom, if we can speak in this personalized way for a moment, why is it important to a mushroom to synergize the erotic sensitivity and sexual activity of primates? And I think the reason for that is that if you understand that biology is a seamless web, that the existence of species is actually a 17th century illusion that utilizes frame-frozen photography of the biosphere to count gene aggregations, and realize instead that the evolutionary career of life on the planet is obviously one project with one intent, then it makes more sense that a primate or mammalian species might have its sexual cycle, or if it is an intelligent species, its erotic self-image manipulated by another species, because we are being regulated through drugs. And this is a general phenomenon of history, whether we're discussing Eros or not, that has been ignored. In other words, think of the impact on European history, we'll say, of coffee, or on the history of the Orient of British manipulation of opium policy, or the impact of sugar in the modern world. Or, in other words, man is the drugged monkey, and various symbiotic relationships with drugs write the history of the human species. So now, what then is the role of these psychedelic drugs, which promote not weakening of forebrain inhibitions, not suppression of hunger or sudden bursts of physical activity that can be harnessed to the purposes of capitalism, but what then is the synergistic role of these hallucinogens? I think it is to promote Eros, not for our own edification, but as a way of saving the planet. In other words, there is no question that what we need is greater caring for the project of being, is how Heidegger put it. We need more love, not only love for each other, but love for the environment, love for the notion of the fate of the species. And this is not airy-fairy stuff. It's perfectly obvious that our survival probably depends on this. In the last 2 or 3 centuries, we have tinkered with social reform, which comes from the top down. In other words, the theoretics of Marxism is a theory of collectivism, the need for collectivism which arises out of a Hegelian analysis of the way thesis and antithesis work themselves out in society. And it hasn't taken. Marxist societies are woeful realizations of human potential. The reason for this, I think, because it can't be a head trip. It has to be visceral. It has to come through the biological, not through the cultural or the ideological level. And I think that the way it was done in prehistory was through the presence of orgiastic religions, shamanic practitioners, and the general accessibility of these states and the general cultural validation of these states in the absence of competing abstractions. When we cannot hope for an absence of competing abstractions, there are too many of them. But we can insist on experiencing the archaic mode by committing ourselves to these archaic activities, one of which is the cultivation of the heightened sensitivity which these compounds give. Consciousness, you see, the great riddle of human evolution is not that it happened, but that it happened so fast. There must be a secret, as yet unelucidated factor in human evolution which has caused the neocortex to so quickly arise and dominate human organization with its products. I think what this is the synergy of idea and emotion that the psychedelics inculcate. The problem is that in the modern context, and certainly I have contributed to this, I've always talked about the ideas that it engendered, and not a lot about the feeling which stood behind it, because it's very hard to talk about that. It actually involves me in some weird way, because my ideas I don't feel are my own, because I could write it down and you could read it aloud and then it would be your idea. But feelings, there is much less, there is no tradition of feelings. I can't have a feeling and say, aha, well, this is a feeling that Whitehead had a number of times, and Voltaire had a cruder version of this particular feeling. And so in the area of feeling, it's like we invent the wheel, each one of us, again and again, over and over, where in the area of ideas, we just splice on whatever idea we have to intellectual history, and it is immediately given a context. So it's a much trickier thing to move out into the realm of feelings and to abandon the idea of linear uniformity. At one moment to realize that at the human level we are one. There is one context, and when you touch the human level in yourself, you're having a primary perception about the organization of other people. And you can even try this out on other people by noticing what you think and then going up to someone and suggesting to them that this is what they think, by using the introductory phrase, "Did you know? I'll bet you did know," and then laying something on them which you actually discovered in the depths of yourself, but which they will quickly line up behind 9 times out of 10. So this establishing of the archaic commonality of human beings, and then laying over that the understanding that that is a different thing from the print-created assumption of uniformity, which makes each of us equal in our voting ability, our ability to consume products, wear clothing, participate in selection of brands, and that sort of thing. There is a common level, and there is a false level of commonality that is something which has been laid on to us. And I'm not paranoid. I don't see it as a plot. It isn't that someone consciously chose the suppression of Eros in order to create civilization, although Freud certainly comes close to suggesting that in Civilization and Its Discontents, that there was actually a decision made for a trade-off. No, I think it's just simply that patriarchal society achieved order through the myth of uniformity, because really the suppression of women is the suppression of this. It began actually as a suppression of emotion, and it ended up as a suppression of women, because women were the most difficult people to emotionally suppress. They were embedded in a cycle of pheromones and hormones and visceral reactions to a cosmic environment that no amount of ideology could get rid of. So their importance was taken away. Since they couldn't be converted, they were just ruled infidels. But this suppression of women and resultant suppression of Eros created the cultural context for a long, long detour into the overvaluing of intellect, materialism, funny notions about how reality is put together that come out as science, which tells you everything you want to know about what you don't care about. The complete devaluation of everything you do care about, and say, oh, well, you care about emotions and how people live their lives. Well, you should read novels or something. In other words, a complete schizophrenia about what is important, where institutions and the lives of ideas completely supplanted people's own experience of being, and the importance of having that be a clear, white-hot, transformative flame that gave their lives meaning. This appetition for being, this longing for being, if suppressed, creates neurosis. And the mass cultural neurosis that we're living through is just, it isn't even a neurosis, it's a psychosis. If Eros is the appetition for being, then Thanatos must be the appetition for non-being. And the patriarchal scientific culture has such an appetition for non-being that things like nuclear stockpiles, realizations like the impact of a nuclear winter, these things don't even faze the institutions with thanatoptic obsession. The news that there could be no winner and that everyone would die in a nuclear exchange because of the resultant crop failures and cold weather, I don't think a meeting was called anywhere on the policy-making level to draw back from the consequences of the previous policy in the light of the new understanding. So the death drive is very strong in our civilization. This is why there is a certain amount of urgency in this issue about psychedelics. And people say, well, we should organize, they should be legalized, we should spread the word, and by legalizing it and spreading the word, I always assume we would spread it thinner. Right. And I think, we aren't ourselves yet shock troops enough to spread it thinner. I don't want more people particularly, to take psilocybin. I think a better idea would be for the people who take it to take more psilocybin. Because, you become deputized by the drug. People are catalysts in the social environment. And what I mean by catalyst, just to revert to the absolute chemical definition, a catalyst is something which speeds a reaction, but is itself not changed by the reaction. And this is what I think we all need to be. We all need to accelerate the ending of history, if by the ending of history we mean this obsession with thanatos. And we do it by example, by ourselves living outside of history. I mean, you end history by living the end of history, not by articulating it as a political goal which we will all achieve together in 1995 or 2012 or whenever. It is, if there is a state outside of history, it will be achieved atomically by each one of us, one by one. In other words, it's like the notion that you can't save anyone else until you have saved your own soul. Then there may be a bodhisattvic obligation. But I believe that what science has done is two things. First of all, in physics, it has carried out so thorough an analysis of matter that matter has been found to be subsumed under the notion ideas. In other words, matter has been found to be the outer edge of self-perception. The other thing that science has done is obtruded on this natural pheromonal interaction between human beings and nature by creating more efficient methods of transferring goods and services, which causes urbanization, which causes the creation of environments which are conceived of as antithetical to nature. So that we have to have a complete reversal of our system of values. And we must realize that, it doesn't matter whether the Z particle exists or not nearly as much as it matters the quality of our relationships with other people. Everything should be shifted back to the foreground. Nothing should be taken for granted that is being imposed from the top. And if we do this, we will slip the harness of all these ideological constructs and actually occupy a point outside of time. The whole 20th century is an obsession with the archaic and an effort to stabilize our culture crisis by transcending history. The missing factor is the hallucinogenic drugs, which at the very beginning of human history synergized humanness out of the monkeys. Noetic archaeology, which is that form of archaeology which digs up not statuary and foundation walls, but ideas and the traces of ideas. Noetic archaeology has achieved, I believe, its greatest triumph, though it's yet to be recognized, in the discovery that the hallucinogens are the formative agent at the beginning of human origins. That discovery will have a tremendous consequence because it will legitimize eventually, and I'm talking in a context of 40 to 100 years, it will legitimize psychedelics as a valid way of experiencing our own humanness, as a valid way of returning to the origins. And so it will end history, even as it created it. It seems to be the catalyst of the historical process, and there are cases in chemistry of catalysts which initiate and end certain processes when certain other molecular species fall into certain proportions. This is what the hallucinogens are doing for us. They created the historical process by synergizing consciousness, and they will further synergize consciousness to end the historical process, because really the historical process is a birth process. You can think of it as a massive flooding of the body of Gaia with hormones, ideas, drugs, religious systems, and human beings, which end with a biocultural planetary event of immense significance, which is us discovering the essence of human freedom and moving off into space to explore it. But it's very useful to make the metaphor of birth, of catalysts by hormones, of interactive bootstrapping processes, symbiotic processes between species, because this is actually what is happening. We are not outside the context of nature. We are the point species, the point gene mass for technology that will open the way to a larger context for all of biology and all of life to realize itself. And that's why Eros, which seems in the modern context to be centered on the generative organs and the simple desire for connection, is actually the life force particularly experienced. It isn't a generalized abstraction. It's the visceral feeling of wanting to live and wanting to touch flesh and perpetuate flesh and be in the context of flesh with meaning. And this is what gives us, if there is any difference between us and the animals, it is the obligation to this form of planetary wholeness, through wholeness of self and wholeness of every atom of human organization, through the couple, the affinity group, the tribe, the larger context of one's friends and acquaintances. And the New Age has the rhetoric of collectivity in the same way that the psychedelic generation of the 60s had the rhetoric of collectivity. But in each case, it was vitiated by various factors which tended to inject masculine values into the context that was evolving. G.K. Chesterton said, "Men are men, but man is a woman." And the problem has been that we have been run by little men. In other words, that small people who bought into the idea that ideas should rule have been at the tiller of history for a very long time. The goddess, which is this hidden notion that men are men, but man is a woman, the goddess has been completely suppressed. Most embryologists would probably agree with the statement that men are hormonally modified female fetuses, and human civilization is a hormonally modified corpus delicti, if you wish. And the hormonal modification is for purposes of transcendence, which once achieved, the historical model of human beings will be useless. I'm sure you know the fable or the story or the folklore about how when Buddha crossed the river of enlightenment in the boat of the Dharma, when he reached the other side, someone said, "What are you going to do with your boat?" And he said, "Well, now that I'm on the other side, I have no need of it." And this is, I think, how we need to think of the patriarchal, linear, uniform culture. It created a context for saving the entire biosphere. Now the entire biosphere can be saved only through the transcendence of that previous context. So it is very important for those people who are interested in psilocybin to go deeper into it and try to language the previously unlanguaged feeling. Because you see, the feeling is not in principle unlanguageable. It's simply that no utility accrued to it in the male constellated value system. Once we understand now that the evolution of communication now depends on the evolution of a language of emotion, we can see that the evolution of a language of emotion is the primary task of psychedelic users, and the using of that language of emotion to communicate and to bootstrap ourselves to higher and higher levels of caring. This will all happen within the context of the project of caring for being, which was Heidegger's formulation for what life is all about. And I have not read Heidegger on Eros, but I do believe that Eros and the project of caring for being cannot be divided apart. Now, I want to close by reading a brief quote from Jacob Needleman that very synchronistically Kat discovered just a few minutes before we left the house today. The impact of Socrates is to produce upon a human being a specific sort of suffering that involves seeing oneself against a very high criterion of what human beings should be. But this seeing of oneself is not a moralistic effort to persuade oneself to do better. On the contrary, its effect is to kindle Eros, a longing for being. The impact of Socratic interrogation, which is objective self-interrogation, is the suffering that results from the repeated and prolonged confrontation in oneself between what is meant to be, between what one is meant to be, and what one is. Until a human being passes through this fire, all of his efforts at virtue will fail. And I think there is no more intense way to pass through that fire than with the psychedelic experience. I've always assumed with the I Ching that the sign of the psychedelic experience was Li, the clinging flame. And I think to pass through that clinging flame is to discover this context of what we may be as opposed to what we are. So I'll now entertain questions. Let me see here. Yes, I'll entertain questions. And then we'll have a break. Yes?
I was surprised to hear you interpret this primal emotion that you were feeling on the low dose of psilocybin as anxiety. Because it would seem to me more that it could be described in terms of hypothalamic arousal, that it might just as easily be seen as elation as anxiety.
Well, hypothalamic arousal is usually characterized as fight or flight. It could be thought of as you characterize it. And I guess eventually I did assimilate it that way. But as it sat on me for a number of days, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to fight or flee. And then slowly those choices were dissolved into the kind of general ecstatic arousal that you're talking about. But I think ecstasy has to be learned.
Well, reminded me what Kathy said. I had a dream in which I had the nightmare terror, but I managed to turn it around and enjoy it. It was a very keen enjoyment. But while I haven't had it very often, it still had a common example in the fear of falling, which children are supposed to be born with. But one of the things they get a kick out of very quickly is a swing or a roller coaster, or being tossed up in the air and caught. So it's possible to reverse reverse your attitude toward an emotion, because the emotion doesn't change, the feeling doesn't change, but it can be very enjoyable. I think that's part of the process. I was hoping you'd say that about the anxiety. I wouldn't select anxiety as an enjoyable thing.
You mean that these emotions can be transmitted into their opposites?
No, I don't mean that. I mean, you turn yourself around and enjoy it.
Yes, you change your own context, your own way of relating to it. Well, this is the process. You meet this in all the great crises that have to do with Eros. I mean, it's very common for 6- and 7-year-old children to announce that they are never getting married. And it's very common for boys on the brink of adolescence to loathe girls. It's because, there is this dread of this thing which is devouring, which is so important that you keep trying out your reactions to it. You can't tell whether you love or hate it. All you know is that you feel something so strongly about it that you keep trying out these various positions. And all movement into the new, as I said earlier in the lecture, engenders this kind of anxiety. The newness of it engenders the anxiety almost before we learn anything else about it. And then later you learn whether you like it or don't like it. But initially, the novelty itself is a source of anxiety. Yeah.
A Reichian interpretation of the same kind of material would suggest that the erotic force and anxiety are one and the same thing, seen in that kind of flip-flop.
That anxiety and the erotic force are the same thing. Well, arousal, again, as was mentioned over here, fight and flight, but there was another F in there, but they're all states of arousal. Yes, language is almost the major catalyst for language is coming up against these unspeakable things, trying to say something about the dizziness of what cannot be said. Is all lyrical love poetry and probably all shamanic chanting is an effort to articulate these things which cannot be said, and they are the most interesting things. That's why the novel, after 220 years, is still going strong as a viable art form, because people are still interested in how people get together and fall apart and how it makes them feel. Yes.
I have two kind of questions. One is the mushroom. What I have understood, I think I saw something on PBS recently about mushrooms and decay and ringworm and things that happen in the earth, and they all seem aren't mushrooms an expression of the earth taking back life, or like a death and decay kind of thing? Isn't it interesting that if that's functioning and to transcend life, that function of decay being life?
Well, all fungi are secondary, whatever the term is in biology. Anyway, they all live off decaying matter. It means it could be seen as that they transform death into life. That death is the raw material of their being, that they transform it into life. Yes, Gordon Wasson has written about the mycophobic and mycophilic societies. People feel very differently about mushrooms. For instance, to the English, all mushrooms are toadstools and you shouldn't touch it because it's poisonous. To Russians, there's, I think, 120 words in Russian for mushroom. And mushroom hunting is a rural activity of European Russians, and it's they are mycophilic. Why cultures relate this way to mushrooms is not well understood. One of the curious things about the equation I mentioned of cow, human being, and mushroom is that the mushroom insinuated itself into the human family by growing on the manure of a domesticated animal. That made sure that wherever the domesticated animal was, the mushroom would be noticed. But it also meant that all all peoples who were coprophobic, who actually had a fear of animal excrement, would associate the mushroom with that and have nothing to do with it. And in the Amazon, where the mushroom exists on the manure of Bos indicus, which has been brought in the last couple of hundred years by the Spanish, the people are furiously using hallucinogenic drugs, indigenous hallucinogenic drugs, but when you ask them about the mushroom, there's usually an expression of reluctance. And with the Huitoto at La Chorrera, there was real disgust because it grew in manure. And so you have, this strange association of life and death. I can't remember. Somebody said we begin. Well, that's too raw. But anyway, we begin in a very messy situation. And then how you feel about that determines how you feel about messy situations and sticky fingers from then on in. Yeah.
Yeah, the other part of it. Well, isn't there an Asian thing, the jewel of the lotus grows out of the shit pile or something like that? Isn't it Namyo Hongre or something? Or one of those other ones?
Well, certainly the jewel, yes, in Vajrayana there is the idea that out of corruption comes the lotus. And in alchemy, this is even stronger. In the Eastern tradition, it's not so much that it arises out of corruption as that it arises out of death, and you're invited to meditate in cemetery grounds and to dismember bodies and to remind yourself of the ephemerality of being by dismembering bodies and this sort of thing. In alchemy, it's much more explicit that out of corruption, the Negredo is the beginning phase of alchemy, the black stage, and out of that corruption comes the whitening. There is a true union of opposites, and alchemy is full of enigmatic sayings, such as that the jewel is to be found in excrement, or look in that which is defiled, and there you will find the philosopher's stone. Just this indication of a coincidentia positorum. And the mushroom is a perfect coincidentia positorum. I mean, it is this sublime mental jewel which is appearing in excrement. It is in shape phallic, but in association to the moon, extremely female and lunar. It seems to be a true coincidentia positorum in that your own point of view decides how you perceive it. Arthur and I were talking earlier this evening about how generally worldwide the moon is a lunar goddess, but there are traces mixed up with early mushroom lore where you get male lunar gods. The god Nanar, or Sen, who was a Sumerian god with a cult at Haran, was a male lunar deity. And someone asked me what was the future of the kind of thing I was talking about, since I talked mostly in terms of historical antecedents and forces which had led us to the present moment. And just briefly to indicate why all this is important is because I think that this recapturing the archaic mode, which may seem to some of you to be fairly advanced by now, is in fact still only in the very most formative stages, and that this is a model for understanding how culture will develop over the next 30 or 40 years. I think entheogens and psychedelics are only beginning to have this visible effect of synergizing Eros in society, so that what I really hope and imagine is happening is that a true anarchy might be possible through the cultivation of responsibility, not out of intellectual appreciation of the need to do that, but out of a more natural and spontaneous and visceral need to do that, which arises quite spontaneously. In other words, anarchy can never be erected on a substratum of theoretical considerations. It has to be erected on a substratum of very intense, realized feelings. And this is what things like the nuclear freeze and the whole liberal agitation for global consciousness of global problems is all about. Realizing the responsibility that we all share toward each other, and then, feeding people in the world who are hungry, curing diseases in portions of the world where diseases are endemic. These will not be great philanthropic undertakings. They will be things seen to be as natural and necessary as caring for your own backyard. And the psychedelics promote this because they show the commonality of being. They make you feel the family of human beings rather than theoretically understand it. The other force which will create this anarchy of responsibility is the evolution of language, which I mentioned in the lecture. Someone asked me more what I meant about that, whether I meant simply new words for new feelings, which is certainly part of it, and much of what's gone on in California in the past 10 years in terms of vocabulary construction has been put down as psychobabble. But nevertheless, there is a useful residuum in that, and that will stay in the language. More than that, I can imagine ontological transformations of language so that we can actually show each other our thoughts by discovering proto-languages or assembly languages in the human organization that do not require a culturally validated dictionary to be understood. In other words, the things like chanting and toning and that sort of thing, they do convey emotions, but very generalized emotions, because at this state of evolution of our emotional vocabularies, all emotions are generalized emotions. But eventually this might be refined to a very high state. I mean, our great artists are capable of this. I can remember when I first read The Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust, there are a number of places in there where you realize with a real sense of shock that you had never even articulated to yourself this feeling, let alone ever attempted to articulate it to another person, because it seems so personal and non-generalizable that you thought it was uniquely yourself, and yet here it is on the printed page. And we need more of this, because seeing that emotion portrayed on the printed page, I have an immense sense of revalidation of my own experience of it. And there are many, many emotions like this. I remember particularly an incident in The Remembrance of Things Past where the narrator, whose name I forget, is riding in a carriage to a very elegant party with this ancient, crumbling Contessa, who is the matron of the society of the Rue de Saint-Germain, and she's prattling on about something, someone's love affair, someone's jewelry, something, and they pass a certain group of trees, which the narrator glimpses out the window, and he feels this immense desire to stop the carriage and to go over and look at the trees for no reason at all. And yet he feels that some kind of immense choice is being made, and that if he doesn't stop the carriage, his life will be irrevocably different and that something very precious will be lost and never regained. And meantime, he's trying to maintain in this intense formal social situation, and he does nothing. And the moment passes and is forgotten by him, I'm sure. But you participate and say, I felt like that. I wanted to do that. And it seemed so irrational, so obscure, so caught up in the processes of my own becoming that I would never even mention or describe it to someone. Here it is, validated as a general experience of human beings. And we need to do this for each other a lot. I'm very shocked to realize how much communication goes on that is not direct communication between human beings. How much reading, listening, watching, how rarely there is actually one-to-one conversation between human beings, and yet that is where the progress really takes place. And we undervalue it. We don't even notice that it's being taken away from us, and that media and packaged interaction is replacing it. So I just wanted to make that point about the future and the future of language in Eros. Yes?
Whenever under the influence of psychedelics I've tried to describe aspects of my experience or my perceptions that I normally either don't notice or don't bother to try to describe, I've always encountered a problem, namely the fact that every sentence that I come up with to describe this experience contains at least one key word and sometimes two or three that has two meanings which are opposites. So that no matter how I try to say the thing, it can be heard as its opposite, which I don't mean. And what's always happened was that I would, somewhere along the way, I would realize that the person that I was talking to already knew what I was trying to say. I picked it up apparently telepathically, so obviously it wasn't necessary. It was not necessary to say it, so I abandoned the attempt. So I never myself came up with a new language for describing these experiences. I've seen only one body of writing that it didn't really develop a new language, but it described experiences in such a way that you could infer something more than what was in it. And it was the writings of Alain Robbe-Grillet, who writes like either a mathematician or an architect on an acid trip.
No, he writes like a person perceiving.
Well, of course, but what kind of person perceiving, you see?
Well, a person who is not deeply bought into abstraction. The banana trees grow, the shadows move across the white wall, the centipede was or was not squashed yesterday. It's immediacy of experience and withdrawal from abstraction. That's one of these things. I mean, he does do one of the things that I think has to be centralized, which is concentrate on the immediacy of experience. It's interesting you mentioning how terms seem to have their opposites built into them. Yes, on psychedelics, every word seems to have its meaning and its opposite tagged right to it. In English, that happens very rarely. I think it was down at Esalen recently we were playing this game, trying to think of English words which mean their opposites as well as themselves. And the best example we found was the word cleave, which means to stick to and to be separated from. But it's important to pay attention to this kind of thing, the way meaning denies itself, or the way meaning reinforces itself. Reality is a coincidentia positorum. It is a union of opposites. It is both one thing and another. It is particle and event. I think, again, For some reason, Heidegger seems to be figuring strongly this evening. But I think it was Heidegger who said, the human body is neither a thing nor a process, but an opening into the absolute. And because that's true, because it's an opening into the absolute, it must contain the opposites. It must be both the affirmation and denial of itself. Yeah.
So this would imply then that in trying to exclude the opposite that I did not want to say, I was in fact trying to slice reality in half and present only one face of it. And that's where I got into trouble.
Yeah, I think that the model for psychedelic communication on one level at this stage is something like Finnegan's Wake, where, first of all, immense erudition, meaning just ability to pick up references, historical, literary, artistic, ethnic, etc. But he realizes that every word is not a surface, but a historical process down which you can travel to touch etymologically other complexes of meaning, so that the simplest statement becomes, in fact, fantastically freighted with significance, as it in fact really is. I mean, we need to get away from the idea of language. We basically use language to write ingredients on the sides of boxes, stuff like that. And what we really need to do is to tease apart the subtle intuitions that we have about being. In another context, I've said that if you're just wandering around in your apartment by yourself, cleaning, and you watch your mind carefully, you will discover that Rome falls 9 times an hour. And what I mean by that is that there's all this stuff going by. We talk about how psychedelics are state-bounded. How, gee, you just can't bring anything out. It's so nebulous and hard to hang on to. Well, but walk up to somebody and ask them, what were you thinking 10 minutes ago? And you'll discover it's at least as state-bounded as a psychedelic state. They haven't the faintest idea what they were thinking. It could have been a random thought about Mallarmé's Mistress, or how do you break eggs without, it's all going past. And very little of it do we care to scoop out and look at. And we live almost completely unconsciously. I mean, we forget even what we say to each other, let alone what we think to ourselves. And this, the other night, at a lecture at Shared Visions, which I sort of regarded as a prologue to this, I made a big thing about attention to attention. Attention to the existing ongoing flow of ratiocination that is the background of being. Most of us, when asked 10 minutes ago, what were you thinking, we don't know. But if asked 10 minutes ago, were you a Democrat? You know, one way or the other, because this kind of thing, rigid categories, you have firmly in place. Everything which is abstract and inherited by you as an idol of the tribe is unambiguous for you, but your own thoughts are as mercurial as being itself, of which they are a major component, you will notice if you pay attention to. Yeah, back here.
Would you talk a little about the this huge escalating alcoholic population we have in our country, and how that might fit in the need for Eros and maybe using that instead of psilocybin or something?
Well, there's a lot of, I mentioned the anxiety of the new. And I think there is more new than ever before, and people, there are drugs which intensify that, and drugs which mask it. Alcohol is sort of a traditional deadening drug. It does have a role to play in the evolution of Eros, but perhaps not a very noble one. Heroin is the drug which I always think of when I think about the suppression of anxiety, the suppression of the anxiety of novelty, because it makes it possible to bear lives which are, getting the backwash from the rush toward the end of history. It's a drug of the disillusioned and the poor and people who want to mask their feelings about reality. It also does not promote Eros at all. There are many, many different chemical strategies for dealing with the problem of being. I am particularly interested in psychedelics because I see them as synergizing consciousness. When drugs are cynically manipulated, as opium was by the British, as in fact sugar was in the 19th century in forming, for instance, the policies of population growth on Java. Java is today the world's most densely populated island, not because people had a lot of babies there throughout history, but because in the mid-19th century the Dutch began paying people to have children in order to have enough people to harvest the labor-intensive sugar. So, whole vast parts of the third world have been demographically distorted in the name of drug production, in this case sugar. I don't use a lot of drugs other than psychedelics. I recently even eliminated coffee, and don't think that drugs generally are a good thing. They operate through the laws of large numbers, especially these drugs which sedate or stimulate to physical activity, and are therefore so well thought of by capitalism. I think that the psychedelic drugs are unique, and the drugs which mimic neurohumoral substrates are even more unique. And what we are really trying to do is not drug ourselves into the future, but rediscover. I don't even think of it as a drug relationship because it is more like an exohormone, something which we need from the outside to make our humanness complete, which seems to me ironically correct, that we would have to go to the world, that we are not complete even in ourselves. The whole myth of Genesis makes that clear. Even in the happiness of the garden, even as the objects of God's love, there was still this tree which, if you ate of it, it would change you. And God didn't say it will kill you or it's bad. He said it contains the knowledge of good and evil, which I reserve unto myself. And the creation and perfection of a secular world demands eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It cannot be left to someone else to decide, even God in a secular world. This is the real nature of existential ethics, that we must eat of the fruit of the tree of life, so that we take unto ourselves the responsibility for determining good and evil. The other situation was that of a playpen, and really did not promote human dignity in the fullest possible sense. Yeah, Phil?
In the introduction to my collection suggests as a possible topic the perception or the creation of a couple, or the interaction of a couple, and then the perception of society of that couple. Could you comment on that?
Well, I can't remember exactly what I said. I said that there was the myths of how couples should be, and then how they should be perceived in the world.
It seemed relative to these psilocybin and Eros.
I think that what should be cultivated is a tremendous amount of variability and situation-specific uniqueness. and that roles have to be overthrown, and the notion that monogamy or hyper heteromorphism or all of these other possible menu choices of how to be are mutually exclusive of other ways of being, or that some are somehow validated and others are experimental. The truth is, when you really get to know people, everybody's relationships are very weird and very unique and based on context of time and situation. I think I said at Shared Visions the other night, my friend Ernie observed that decadence is nothing more than knowing what your neighbors are really doing. Decadence is a kind of excessive social communications, which then causes everyone to realize, well, my God, these myths I've been living by, nobody else gives a hoot for, so why should I? We would save ourselves a lot of time if we just admitted that all contexts are unique and all people are unique, and the uniqueness need not be glorified to the point of egomania, but neither should we accommodate ourselves to the notion that we are as uniform as print created words or capitalistically created products or democratically created voter citizens. All of these generalized abstractions do considerable damage to our uniqueness, which is the springboard to our own realization of being. I think most neurosis in the world, or you could almost just simply define neurosis as undervaluation of the importance of experience. And then you say, well, gee, I'm not like I think I should be. I'm not like my mother or my wife or my boss feels I should. This is all having to do with the projection and transference of images that the person who is the victim is intellectually and emotionally unable to cast off because they bought in too deeply. Now, the psychedelics as deconditioning agents make that much tougher. And I've always maintained that this really was what threatened society about psychedelics. People don't care if in the confines of your apartment you have visions. It's just what you believe generally later about those visions that is troubling to society. And if you believe that it means that state ideologies should be questioned, or that authority is not acting at the direct behest of God, any of these notions are highly suspect and very dangerous and will naturally bring an effort to control. And that's really the activity that the psychedelics are having. That's why religions, as soon as they get a dogma hammered out and in place, are usually very interested to suppress the ecstatic source of revelation. They don't want that anymore. Any of you who know the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov, Christ shows up. And the Inquisitor says, Christ says, do you know who I am? Do you know who you're about to torture? He says, yes, I know who you are. We don't need you now. You're the last person we need. You're going to make big trouble. And we've got it all wired together. This is, the tension of priestcraft against the tension of the numinosity of the mystery. The thing that is so subversive about psychedelics or about psilocybin is here is a God who can speak for itself. It requires no exegesis, no priest, no theological experts. You attain direct experience of the faith, and this means it's very hard to erect churches and pass collection plates and all of the things which give institutional life to a religion. Any other questions? In the back.
Yes, could you elaborate on your phrase
longing for being. I'm especially interested in what you mean by the word being, because I think that a lot of us associate that with various models and theories of self-actualization, which I think tend to be arbitrary and rather restrictive.
Well,
So I'd like to hear you talk about that.
I usually use being in the Heideggerian sense of Dasein, of the field of self-identification which surrounds the body, and obviously being. This is the whole branch of philosophy that ontology is concerned with, the nature of being. I mean the sense of self in the moment. Appetition for being, desire for being, is desire for authentic existence, and it is very elusive because we are in a state of becoming. We are the becoming creature. We do not participate in authentic being in this life. Authentic being is for us a metaphysical hypostatization which throws a long shadow into the three-dimensional world of metabolism and experience. But it is not something which you authenticate in life except intuitionally. What true being is, we can't know. That's why we have the erotic longing for it. That's why I was talking to this lady here about the poignancy of life is not to be suppressed. The gentle sadness which is through everything is not an emotion to flee from. It is in fact part of the tension of becoming and not being. And if you take it as something to be repressed and have a false myth, which is the myth that that this is authentic being, and I am happy with it, you will not be happy with it. You will say, if this is authentic being, what's the matter with me that I feel so incomplete in it? It's much better to acknowledge the dreadful freedom, which is a favorite existential phrase, the dreadful freedom that can only exist in the dimension of becoming, and to orient yourself towards spiritual values, toward transcendental objects which cast a shadow into being, but to not be deluded about where you are in the scale of things. A simple way of saying that is, getting there is half the fun, so why not relax and enjoy it? Yes?
Dominion. In Arthur's process, seventh level, dominion. I think that's what we're coming towards.
Yes, and as in Arthur's theory, these things are only attained through a constraint. All assumptions of greater degrees of freedom are attained through the assumption of a temporary constraint. Yes, I agree. The temporary constraint in the case of the psychedelic experience is the self-discipline to be able to do it. You know, you are your ordinary self. To take the drug, you must discipline that ordinary self to face the plunge into a more authentic approach to being. And then, having done that and coming through beyond it, there is then a new level of self-definition that accrues from the act of courage. But I don't think you can, I think that being requires, or becoming requires courage. Otherwise, that which is fear-inducing will be repressed, and that's the basis for neurosis. I think that must be what lies behind all this talk you hear about being a warrior. What they're really trying to say is you have to meet becoming with a willingness to accept the fact that it is a provisional state. It is only a shadow of authentic being, which can be which can be known through intuition and through mystical voyaging, but it can't be subsumed into being this side of the grave as far as we know. I mean, people who make claims otherwise have grotesque lives because they lead a bunch of lame people of some sort, and the whole thing appears to be just a complete flight from authentic being.